So let's get right into it. We're looking at a really volatile situation brewing between the United States and Colombia, two countries that have been close allies for a long, long time. And what might look like a sudden crisis is actually something that's been building for decades, all thanks to drugs, war, and two governments with completely different priorities. It all finally boiled over with a war of words that could, honestly, turn into a real war.
It all kicked off in early 2026. Now remember, this was right after a pretty controversial U.S. military operation that led to the capture of Venezuela's president, while Donald Trump immediately turned his focus to another neighbor, Colombia. He came out with this just stunning statement, calling the country's leader a drug trafficker and dropping a not-so-subtle threat. The message couldn't have been clearer. You're next. Well, Colombia's President Gustavo Petro, who was actually a guerrilla fighter back in the day, he did not back down, not one bit. He fired back with this incredibly dramatic and defiant promise, basically saying he'd take up arms himself to defend his country. And just like that, the diplomatic gloves were off. The stage was set for a really dangerous confrontation.
So you have to be asking yourself, how on earth did we get here? I mean, for decades, Colombia has been one of America's closest partners in all of Latin America. This kind of breakdown seems to come out of absolutely nowhere. But the truth is, the roots of this crisis run deep. They're all tangled up in a long and brutal history of violence, corruption, and a whole lot of failed attempts at peace.
To really get what's happening, we've got to rewind. We need to look back at the decades of complex internal wars that have really defined modern Colombia. It's a story where the lines between the good guys and the bad guys, between the government, powerful criminals, and political groups have gotten dangerously blurry.
For so long, the story of Colombia was completely dominated by these massive drug cartels. You know, back in the 80s, you had the sheer, raw violence of Pablo Escobar and his Medellin cartel. Then, in the 90s, things shifted. The Cali cartel took over, and they were different, more sophisticated. They preferred to use bribery instead of bombs, working to corrupt the entire system from the inside out. But here's the thing, even after these huge cartels were taken down, the drug trade never went away. It just shattered into smaller pieces, embedding itself even deeper into the country.
But the cartels weren't the only ones fighting this war. Oh no. In response to leftist guerrilla movements, another incredibly powerful and brutal force popped up, the right-wing paramilitary groups. Think of them as private armies, created to protect business interests and fight a dirty war against anyone they even suspected of being a guerrilla sympathizer.
And their tactics were, well, they were just horrific. I mean, look at this list. We're talking about massacres, torture, people just disappearing. These groups were financed by the drug trade, and they unleashed this wave of pure terror on civilians. And what's really disturbing is the amount of evidence showing they often operated with a wink and a nod from state security forces, if not their outright help.
So here's the key takeaway. This decades-long conflict, fueled by an ocean of drug money, had this deeply corrosive effect on the whole country. It weakened the government, it made extreme violence seem normal, and it created what some people call a narco-democracy, a state where it's hard to tell where the government ends and the criminal world begins.
So, with all this chaos, how has Colombia tried to escape this nightmare? Well, let's take a look at the history of their peace deals, because the way these deals have often failed is absolutely central to understanding the current government's policies and why those policies are putting them on a collision course with Washington.
This right here is a perfect example of how these peace deals often went wrong. This is from a 2005 Human Rights Watch report about an attempt to get paramilitary groups to disarm. The huge criticism was that these deals gave criminals all kinds of benefits, like lighter sentences, but they didn't actually dismantle their criminal networks or get any real justice for the victims. In this case, the paramilitaries even hired fake fighters to pad their numbers, making the whole thing what the report literally called a public embarrassment.
And this whole history of flawed deals brings us right up to the present day and to President Petro's signature policy. It's an incredibly ambitious, some would say impossible plan, called total peace. The goal is just audacious, to negotiate with every single armed group in the country, all at the same time, to finally end the conflict.
The policy itself is split into two different paths. For groups that have a political ideology, like the ELN guerrillas, the government is offering a formal peace negotiation. But for the purely criminal outfits, like drug gangs, it's offering something called a socio-juridical conversation, which is basically a fancy term for a negotiated surrender. And it's this second path, the one that offers deals to drug traffickers, that's causing all the friction with the United States. But for all its ambition, the total peace policy is really struggling at home.
By the middle of 2025, talks had broken down with several groups, and violence was actually getting worse in some parts of the country. This has made the public deeply skeptical. Just look at this poll. A massive 70% of Colombians believe the policy was completely on the wrong track.
Okay, so you've got this very controversial, struggling peace policy happening inside Colombia, but at the exact same time, there's an explosion happening in the global drug trade. And the collision of these two things has created an absolute perfect storm, one that's put Colombia directly in the Trump administration's crosshairs.
A recent UN report dropped an absolute bombshell. In 2023, global cocaine production didn't just go up, it skyrocketed to an all-time high of over 3,700 tons. Let me put that in perspective for you. That is a tenfold increase in just 10 years. A surge like that completely changes the game. And this chart makes it painfully clear where all that cocaine is coming from. Colombia is still, by far, the undisputed epicenter of production. We're talking more than 2/3 of all the coca grown in the entire world. So if you're sitting in Washington, the problem isn't just a little worse, it's exploding. And it's all happening on President Petro's watch.
This massive cocaine surge led to a very rapid, very severe breakdown in relations. In late 2025, the Trump administration started taking action. First, they decertified Colombia, which is a formal way of saying the country isn't helping in the war on drugs. Then, they took the personal step of revoking President Petro's visa. And finally, they hit him with direct personal sanctions, a move you usually see reserved for dictators, not the leaders of allied nations.
When you boil it all down, this whole conflict comes from a fundamental disagreement that's been there for years. For the United States, priority number one is stopping drugs from crossing the border, period. But for Colombia, a country that has lived through generations of horrific violence, the number one priority is just ending the bloodshed. Petro's total peace plan is designed to reduce violence, but from Washington's perspective, it just looks like he's going soft on the very criminals who are fueling this record-breaking cocaine boom.
And that brings us right back to today. We're now in a dangerous standoff where all that heated rhetoric we heard at the beginning is threatening to become a devastating reality, potentially pushing two countries that have been allies for so long into an absolutely unthinkable conflict. And these are no longer just implied threats. In late 2025, you had senior U.S. officials, like Senator Lindsey Graham, openly talking about potential military operations against Colombia. The situation has escalated from sanctions and angry words to the very real possibility of armed intervention. So the stage is set for a historic showdown. On one side, you have a U.S. administration that seems determined to stop this cocaine surge by any means necessary, and on the other, you have a Colombian leader desperately trying to end his country's half-century of internal violence through negotiation. With both sides so dug in on their positions, you're left with one really dangerous question. Is there any path away from the brink?